welcome everyone to another Hot Politics Lab meeting. I'm very excited to have Ashley Jardina as our guest today. Ashley is an assistant professor at Duke University, and she recently published a book, White Identity Politics, in which she discusses racial attitudes and conflict, and particularly the role of how group identity influences a range of different political behaviors in the United States. So yet again, we have an extremely topical speaker, and so that's why I'm really excited to have you, Ashley. And as usual, there will be a presentation of about 20 minutes. After you can type your questions into the Q&A box. Those are the two balloons down on your screen, and during the Q&A, Bert will read out your questions. I see we have about 20 participants now from a lot of different places in the world, so that's great to have. So good morning and good evening to some of you, and without further ado, I want to give the floor to Ashley.
Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And yeah, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you. It's 9 a.m. here, and so this is a really nice way to start my morning. I'm going to share my screen here, and because of the short time period, I'm going to kind of give a cursory overview of my book, and I want us to have kind of a chance to talk about where things are today and maybe think about this in wake of the political election in the United States. And so I'm going to kind of go through this in a way that's a little bit more cursory than I normally would. But I want to begin by taking us back in time a little bit to set the stage here. So in 2010, in the wake of the 2010 U.S. Census, we started to see all of these projections emerging about the changing population of the United States. So we knew that whites were no longer going to be a majority of the United States population by sometime in the middle of the century. This wasn't exactly news, but like demographers had been projecting this for some period of time. But the extent to which this became sort of front and center in the media, became part of public discourse, really changed after 2010. Of course, other things happening in the United States at this time. You've got in 2012, the historic election of Barack Obama, and this is really symbolic for the United States, right? The election of the first African-American, but also, right, put differently, the election of the first non-white person in the United States to the highest elected office in the country. And then, of course, as we all know, in 2016, we saw the election of Donald Trump. This was, by all measures, Trump was a very unconventional presidential candidate. He openly disparaged racial and ethnic minorities. He was slow to distance himself from the endorsement of white nationalists and white supremacists. And, he took up a rather unconventional set of policy positions compared to the standard Republican platform in the US. And we can talk a little bit more about that. And then in the wake of Trump, around Trump's election, we also saw the rise of a lot of right-wing white supremacist groups in the US who began to capture far more public attention than they had in the past. And by places that actually measure the rise and the activity of hate groups definitely noted that there was an increase in their activity under the Obama era, but they were certainly reinvigorated by Trump's election. And if we look at just a general white public opinion during this time, we see that some really interesting trends. So white Americans during this period start to report that discrimination against their group has become as big of a problem, if not bigger, than discrimination against Black people and other racial and ethnic minorities. And some whites even started advocating for a White History Month in the United States, with this idea that we have a Black History Month in the United States where we celebrate the success and the achievements of African Americans. Many white Americans thought, like, Black people have a Black History Month, then surely white Americans should have a White History Month. And if you go back during this period of time, during the Obama era, and you start to see what some really popular conservative pundits were saying. They were saying things like, white people are a new oppressed minority. They're moving to the back of the bus. Bill O'Reilly said that the white establishment is now the minority. It's not traditional America anymore. Pat Buchanan says this in 2010, but let's be honest, Pat Buchanan had been saying this to the American public for like really 20 years prior to this, that white America is an endangered species. And this kind of commentary wasn't limited to conservative right-wing pundits. A lot of major news sources in the United States were asking similar questions, framing things in similar ways, asking, is this the end of white America? What will a white minority in the US look like? Are white people racially oppressed? And so on and so forth. And it might seem sort of surprising to you now, given what we know and given the political landscape in the United States over the past 4 or so years. But for a long time, the idea that we would be talking about white people in the US as a group that had these sort of set of shared interests to social scientists and political science in particular was really unusual. So the dominant paradigm in the social sciences was that white people didn't think about their race. White consciousness is not a politically consequential force. And the argument here is that it follows a sort of metaphor, just as fish don't see water, white people don't see their race, because as the group that has the lion's share of social, political, and economic power in the US, they're not constantly reminded about their racial group. They sort of get to cast their identity as white people as in the image of the national identity. Being white is being American, and I think about being American perhaps, but I don't usually think about being white. That was the kind of argument. And so what that means is that when we've usually thought about the role that race plays for white people in politics, it's always been with respect to the attitudes that not that white people have about themselves and their in-group, but instead the attitudes that white people have toward racial outgroups, toward people of color in the United States. So part of what I've been doing in my work is kind of taking a step back and getting us out of this framework of thinking about prejudice, and instead going into the world of social psychology, and outside of just of the domain of race, but inside the domain of just thinking about intergroup conflict. Social psychologists have long argued that humans just have this natural proclivity to sort the world into in-groups and out-groups. And when we do this, there's a whole set of psychological effects to this kind of sorting. And this is the kind of framework that I'm trying to put the race scholars and people who study racial attitudes back into, to say, if we want to understand racial conflict, we want to understand how different groups see themselves, let's go back to thinking about things like social identity theory and to thinking about intergroup conflict. But we have to understand that if we're going to apply this framework to thinking about the way racial groups in the United States interact with one another, we also have to keep in mind that in the US, racial groups are organized really hierarchically, with white people at the top and other racial and ethnic groups somewhere on this ladder, and arguably with Black Americans sort of at the very bottom of this racial hierarchy. Because we can't just recognize that people are sort of groups equally vying for power, but instead that white people are at the top. And part of why this matters is that when white people feel secure at the top of this hierarchy, this is when we don't really find a lot of effects for these in-group attitudes. White people don't have to think about being white when they aren't given a reason to. But when there are threats to this arrangement, when white people are worried about their position at the top of this hierarchy, I argue, that's when white Americans start to become more aware of their racial group and their racial identity. So to kind of give you a little bit of an overview again here, the common assumption for a long time in political science was that the extent to which racial attitudes matter among white people in the US, it was with respect to outgroup animus and to racial prejudice, and that white in-group attitudes far less consequential. So what I'm doing in my work is I'm revising these assumptions. I'm saying white Americans actually do identify with their racial group. And what is more, that this identity is actually independent of outgroup prejudice. I'm going to talk more about this, but the argument that I'm making is that it's not that in-group identity and out-group attitudes are wholly unrelated, but that they are in fact separate independent constructs. One of the things that I really clearly demonstrate empirically in my work is that there are a lot of white Americans who have this sense of racial solidarity with their group, one that helps maintain certainly a system of racism in the United States. But a lot of those Americans don't also simultaneously have a strong sense of animosity toward people of color. Now, those in-group attitudes in many ways can get to the same set of policy preferences that someone who we think of as overtly racist toward Black people, for example, might arrive at. But they get there for different reasons. And so this is a really important part of the story here, because what it means ultimately, and I'll talk about this in the conclusion, is that you actually have sort of two independent sets of white people in the United States, for example, who support Donald Trump for different reasons. Some of those people support Donald Trump because they're worried about their in-group, and some of them support Donald Trump because they have these feelings of animosity toward racial and ethnic minorities. And of course, the argument that I'm ultimately making here is that white identity, just like racial prejudice, is politically consequential. The idea is that this threat, this status threat, can activate dominant group identities that we often think of as latent or invisible or inconsequential. And the other argument that I make is that a lot of empirical work that looked for the effect of white racial solidarity in the past, this is work by David Sears, Donald Kinder in particular, and part of why they were doing this is they saw white identity as kind of an alternative theory to their theory of racial resentment, which is a theory about racial outgroup attitudes and their political consequences. And so they were trying to kind of demonstrate that, hey, white identity doesn't really matter. And I think one of the limitations of this work is that they, first of all, didn't acknowledge the possibility that white identity could matter if changes in the political environment happened. But they also didn't really acknowledge the fact that white identity isn't just about a preference for or a lack of support for policies that benefit racial and ethnic minorities, but that it's actually far more likely to be related to policies that benefit white people. So they are often looking for this relationship between white identity, for example, and attitudes toward things like providing more spending for Black people in the United States, or more aid for Black people in the US. So why does it matter now? Well, as you know, as I started talking about, there's sort of this confluence of things that's happening in the United States in the mid-2000s. We've had we observed the effects of major changing demographics in the US. We've seen the population of the US has shifted. Part of this is due to this large wave of immigration that the US experienced in the late 1990s, moving into the 2000s. And then you've got all of the visible effects of this, the success of Barack Obama, the rise is sort of in the media and pop culture of different racial and ethnic minorities who are now becoming like highly visible in elected office, on TV, in all of these other places. And so, suddenly I think a lot of white Americans were like, hey, the image of the country as an image that reflects me and who I am is really shifting here and changing in a really big way. I make this distinction in my work between two types of racial solidarity. I'm going to kind of skip over this now, but I'm happy to talk about it a little bit more. But I talk about white identity. I also talk about this idea of consciousness. And the difference between the two is identity is just this psychological attachment. Consciousness is psychological attachment plus a set of really explicit beliefs about what your group should be doing, that it should be working collectively in politics to try to change policies that you think don't benefit your group. Okay, so what are the consequences of this identity? I argue that there are a range of them. One is that you have this desire to protect and support policies that benefit whites. And that means that a lot of white identifiers don't like immigration because it's changing the demographics of the country. There's another sort of surprising effect here, which is that they have this strong support for Social Security and Medicare. Now, in the United States, racial animosity, racial outgroup attitudes are often associated with with opposition to redistributive policies. So like welfare in the United States is really unpopular because white people see it as a policy that disproportionately benefits Black Americans. But and Nick Winter actually should be credited with developing this idea and this framework. He talks about this in his book. But Social Security and Medicare in the US have actually been framed historically and deliberately as policies that are counter stereotypical to welfare, where welfare is for people who are out of work, who need assistance. Social Security is a policy that people get as a reward for working over time. You pay Social Security as part of your income, and then once you retire, you get that money back. And so my argument is that Social Security is actually should be associated with whiteness. It's sort of tied up in these beliefs and these positive stereotypes that we have about white people as like hardworking Americans relative to people of color in the United States who are seen as people who who intentionally are unemployed. And then obviously, not surprisingly, we expect this to be associated with opposition to Obama and support for Donald Trump. So how do we measure this? I'm going to skip over the measure of consciousness. I'm happy to come back and talk about it, but I actually get at this with a very straightforward, simple question. How important is being white to your identity? And I asked this on nationally representative surveys in the United States, and I find that somewhere between 30 and 40% of white Americans say that being white is very, if not extremely important to their identity. I add a couple questions to get at consciousness. I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time, but what you can see here too is when I measure consciousness, there's some pretty notable variation here as well. A lot of white Americans have this sense of consciousness. And my expectation is that both of these things are connected first to immigration attitudes, right? Immigration is viewed in the US as threatening to this Anglo-Protestant culture. It's contributed to these demographic trends. And that's exactly what I find. So what I have here is using American National Election Study data, the gold standard for public opinion data in the United States. They included this measure of white identity on the 2012 ANES survey. What I find here is that as levels of white identity increase, so does opposition to immigration. And this is controlling for a whole host of other things that we think might matter for immigration attitudes, like political partisanship, employment status, personal economic evaluations, so on and so forth. And we find that white identity is strongly associated with opposition to immigration. I have just one question here, but one of the things that I do in my work is I look at basically every possible immigration attitude you might have, and it turns out that white identity is overwhelmingly connected with just immigration attitudes on the whole. So it's not just should we decrease immigration, but things like, do you believe that immigrants take jobs away from American citizens? People with higher levels of white identity are much more likely to believe that immigrants take jobs away from American citizens than people with lower levels of white identity, which is also indicative of the fact that this argument that immigration attitudes in the United States are primarily driven by economic anxiety, I think many people have debunked this, but my work is certainly consistent with this argument that economic anxiety really isn't the driving factor of immigration attitudes in the US. Just sort of give you a sense of the, sort of different things I've asked about. It's build a wall along the US border, higher levels of white identity strongly associated with that. Belief that immigrants commit higher rates of crime, white identity strongly associated with that. So what about things like Social Security and Medicare? Again, I find very similar effects in the same direction. White Americans with higher levels of white identity, far more supportive of Social Security. Same thing with Medicare, far more supportive of Medicare. Again, each of these things I'm showing you here, the trend, even after controlling for a host of other things that we think might be associated with these policies. So that gets us to Barack Obama. Same thing, the narrative, right, among political scientists, especially in the wake of the Obama election, we now have like this sort of stack of research that shows that that one of the strongest predictors of opposition to Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012 was animosity toward Black people. And that certainly remains true. But it turns out that even after you control for things like racial resentment, racial prejudice, anti-Black stereotypes, that white identity was a really strong predictor of opposition to Barack Obama. So, whites who had higher levels of white identity were far less likely to vote for Obama in 2012, far more likely to vote for Romney. But the other thing is that part of why they were more likely to vote for Obama, what I have here is that a lot of white Americans thought that Barack Obama was likely to favor Black people over white people. So you can see there's this relationship between levels of white identity and this belief that Barack Obama was more likely to do things that benefited Black people and less likely to do things that benefited white people. Okay, so that gets us to 2016. One of the things that I like to point out, right, is, so I talk a lot about how white identity is really tied up in beliefs about changing demographics, anxiety about changing demographics. So this image right here, this is an image of Donald Trump's campaign website when he began his presidential campaign in 2015. And if you went to the website, and you can do this, you can use the Internet Wayback Machine to go to his campaign website and see it as it existed in August of 2015. If you clicked on the positions link at the top of the website, the only position that he had was immigration reform. So he began his campaign talking almost wholly and exclusively about immigration reform, right? So totally appealing to the subset of whites who were really concerned about immigration in the United States. He also did some really interesting things. He departed ways with the traditional Republican Party platform in the United States of being anti-government, being anti-social welfare policy. And he didn't come out, obviously, and say, I support welfare. He would never have done that. But he did say, I'm not going to make cuts to Social Security. I'm not going to make cuts to Medicare. I think the Medicaid thing in here, to be perfectly honest, is because he doesn't know what Medicaid is. But he takes credit for and suggests, like, I'm going to protect these programs, right? And in some ways, it's like following the sort of perfect playbook of someone appealing to this subset of white Americans who want policies that are for their group, who don't want immigration. And if we look at the effects of white identity on Trump support, this is the probability of selecting Donald Trump in the primaries, the presidential primaries back in January of 2016 over every other Republican presidential candidate. So I'm not even talking here about vote choice ultimately in 2016. I'm just saying, looking at, is white identity just predictive of support for Republican candidates, or was Trump unique? And what we see quite clearly is Trump was in fact unique. People high on this identity liked Trump over any of the other front-running Republican presidential candidates early in the race. And to kind of illustrate this a different way, what I have here in this chart is the relationship between white identity and affective evaluations of the different political candidates in 2016. So these are the dependent variable here are these feeling thermometer evaluations where you rate how warm or cold you feel toward different candidates. And what you can see is that white identity wasn't predictive of attitudes toward any of the other presidential candidates, Democrat or Republican, but it was strongly tied to more positive feelings toward Donald Trump. So just to end here, what I'm suggesting is that there are these two forces in American politics. One is this sense of in-group attitudes. And of course, I'm not suggesting that all of this work that's been done on white racial prejudice is irrelevant, but that in fact, what we've done is we've overlooked the fact that there's this confluence of things, these two forces working independently and in tandem to get a lot of white people to support Donald Trump, for example. And, the political environment can influence these different levels of white identity. We can talk a little bit about that. But, a lot of the question I sort of get is like, well, how do we get ourselves out of this? And I think that to some extent, we can talk about this. There's some norms that push back against this. But on the other hand, even I was a little bit surprised by the election results that came in last week. Right, you've got just despite the cries of the media of Trump's racism, this rise in conversations about white identity politics being problematic in the U.S. What we're really seeing is that 70 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, and the vast majority of white people in the United States voted for Donald Trump. So you've got almost, depending on what exit polls you read, almost 60% of white Americans chose Trump in the 2020 election. And so there's a lot to suggest that both white identity and white prejudice remain really powerful forces, and probably will remain very powerful forces in American politics. So I'll end there, and I'm looking forward to taking your questions.
Thanks a lot, Ashley.
Thank you.
Great presentation. And it's, sorry, Bert, I'm taking your...
That's okay. So enthusiastic. You can ask the first question.
Yeah, maybe. I
give the floor to Gijs Schumacher.
I had a question about, one of the things that really surprised me last week to hear is that Joe Biden is only the second Catholic president in the history. And so my question is about how coherent is white identity, and how strongly are older, let's say, within white identities like Catholicism, Irish, Italian, how important are these in this concept?
Yeah, I love this question, because I think it's really interesting to think about the transition in the United States that happened, over the course of the 20th century in terms of the significance of white ethnic identities. And, so basically post 1900 in the US, moving into really the 1980s, these ethnic identities that a lot of white Americans had, their attachment to being Italian, their attachment to being Irish, these were both like really important for how people saw themselves, but in some ways it was really important to how they voted. And a lot of sociologists have done some really great work looking at the importance of this over time. So like Mary Waters, Richard Alba had done amazing work researching the significance of these white ethnic identities. And what they conclude is that really by the late 1990s, due to generational displacement and due to assimilation, these identities just became mostly irrelevant, especially to politics. To the extent that they matter, they kind of matter at Christmas time when you're deciding like, what family recipe am I going to make? But that, you know, the idea of like an Irish vote and the Italian vote, while it still might matter a little bit locally in some ethnic enclaves in the United States, really has lost a lot of its significance. And I think that's part of why this racial identity, in fact, does matter. A lot of people who might otherwise sort of put their group identity into this pot of an ethnic identity, what that's transformed into is this kind of like white identity you could see as sort of being this like very Eurocentric identity, this, you know, this sort of idea, like, I mean, and it gets tied up with these ideas about America being a melting pot. Well, what a melting pot of what? It's most people, when they think about that, it's a melting pot of all those European immigrants now, like Irish, Italian, Hungarian, we're all basically the same. But, you know, this white identity, it certainly isn't tied to like whiteness, as people might think about it, like from immigrants from like South and Central America, for example. And so the short answer to your question is that those ethnic identities have really declined in their significance. And in turn, what we're seeing is this kind of pan-white, pan-European identity replacing those attitudes.
Great. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Ashley, as I said, I'll read them out and then you can comment. The first is from Nicholas Loeff. How generalizable is the idea that status threat can activate white group identities? I very recently read a paper that claims that threats towards the in-group and the out-group mobilize authoritarians rather than people in general. So might it just be that white authoritarians or white people who have a social dominance orientation who are affected by social threat?
Yeah, so you're right. So it's not super generalizable in the sense that it's not the case that all white Americans have a white identity. It's a sizable percentage of them, 30 to 40%. But to Nicholas, to your question, the strongest predictor of whether you adopt, one of the strongest predictors of whether you adopt white identity based on the work that I've done is how high are you in social dominance orientation. So the way I see it is sort of social dominance orientation is this like precursor, right? If we, you know, we can, I think there's a lot of debate over what do we think of social dominance orientation is. I'm going to go with Sedanius, even though he's a little inconsistent about this, and say we're going to call this a personality predisposition. There is some inconsistency in actually how he defines this, but if you think about it as a personality predisposition, it's pretty downstream or upstream, and then you get, or downstream, and then you get to sort of these group identities, which are, I think, much more closely tied to politics than social dominance orientation. But I think this is a place where there's also room to do more work, because the stuff that I've done with these personality traits has only been on convenience samples. It's hard to get it's very expensive to get nationally representative public opinion data. And so they haven't asked the SDO scale on the American National Election Study in a while. And it would be great to sort of understand this more, but you know, nevertheless, it's clear that these personality traits are also pretty widely distributed across the American population. So to say it's not generalizable to all white people certainly isn't to suggest that it's not nevertheless pretty consequential. There's a sizable enough percentage of them that have this orientation that then adopt this identity that clearly it has pretty significant effects on our political system.
Great. I was just thinking that maybe like Chris Sibley and Danny Osborne in New Zealand might have some. It's like not American data, but they have all sorts of individual differences, and they might have asked about. I'm actually pretty sure they've asked about New Zealand sort of identity. So that might, if you ever want to sort of study another context, that might be persons to reach out to.
Yeah, that's really helpful actually, because one of the things I am doing is I'm extending this work to Canada. So we put the white identity questions on the Canadian National Election Study, but that certainly also begs like just kind of thinking about this among other Western countries as well. So that's really helpful. Thanks, Bert.
Yeah. There's a question from Robin Totschel. Thank you for your insights. Do you know to what extent negative outgroup sentiments, in other words, prejudice, are also characteristics for other racial identity groups?
What extent are they other?
Yeah. So do you know to what extent negative outgroup sentiments are also characteristics for other racial identity groups? So I guess how we should understand the question is this tied to white specific, or could there also be sort of, would this mechanism work similarly for other groups, right? Like African American?
So I think that there are a couple of things to think about here. One is, so to keep in mind, that argument that I'm making is that in-group attitudes and out-group prejudice for white people are these distinct contracts. They're not that related to each other. So the correlation between them is like, actually, like if you use racial resentment or use these stereotype measures, it's only around 0.2 or 0.3. But so like what happens if we then think about both these sets of attitudes among other racial and ethnic groups in the United States? So we know that African Americans have high levels of in-group identity, but that identity comes not from status threat by way of them being a dominant group. It comes from them being a subordinated group that wants to achieve a higher level of status. And so there's sort of different qualities to it. There's sort of different underlying motivation. And sort of different sets of preferences. In terms of like racial animosity among those groups, we don't actually spend a lot of time studying racial prejudice among racial and ethnic minorities because we often don't think of it as like being determinate or consequential. But there's some good work that's looked at. For example, Jim Gibson has some stuff where he's looked at whether higher levels of in-group identity among Black people in South Africa lead to higher levels of animosity toward white people in South Africa. And he finds that that's not actually the case. So it doesn't I don't find that it's much of a reciprocal relationship in the United States, and taken outside the US to other contexts, and even looking at sort of other groups within, there's some stuff on this, like among college students in the US, don't tend to find that strong in-group identities don't often lead to strong out-group animosity among any groups, actually.
Okay, next question is from Ursula Dexeker. Thanks a lot for a great talk, and I look forward to reading your book. Ursula has 3 questions. I'm for now picking one, and then we might return to some of the other questions because there are also a couple of other people who've asked questions. So I can pick. The first is, how does attachment to white identity vary geographically in the US? Is it higher or lower in places where people should feel more or less threatened because of, for instance, immigration?
Yeah. So I think that this is a question where it's still a little bit to be determined, but let me tell you a couple of things that I know. So one is I actually had a different expectation at first, which is that given the legacy of racism and really of white supremacy in the American South, that Southerners would have higher levels of white identity. And then I also had a similar expectation, like, would you see it, and would this identity be higher in places where there's been a greater change in levels of immigration? And both of these questions are difficult to really answer well empirically because of limitations with data. So, I have these nationally representative data sets, but they rely on this cluster sampling method where they draw data from like the most populous areas of the United States, which means that they get a lot of people in metro areas and not enough geographic dispersion that you can actually carefully test this hypothesis. But to the extent that I can, I don't find that Southerners are that much more, that they have a stronger level of identity. Actually, there's a tiny slight correlation that's kind of easy to make disappear. I don't find that levels of white identity are higher in places where there's been a big shift in immigration, but I do find some evidence that people in those places are more likely to apply that identity to their political attitude. So this is a difference between levels versus the application of this identity to politics. So another way of putting this very like sort of in the terms of like empirical social science, if I look at the interaction between the change in immigration and white identity, I find that that the effect on political preferences is stronger in places where you've seen a bigger change in immigration.
Yes, thanks. This is that's super interesting. I'll probably return to some of Ursula's other questions, but first cover a couple of other questions. It's a question from Juliet. Could you elaborate a bit more on how exactly you've measured white identity? Besides the question how important being white is to your identity, what are other things you included in your measures of white identity?
Yeah, so oftentimes that single measure is the one that's most available on surveys. So a lot of these questions were ones that I crafted and then I had placed on the American National Election Study, but the space is very limited. And I should say that I spend a lot of time defending this single item measure, because a lot of people are like, oh, it's a single item measure. And then especially if you're steeped in psychology, you're like, you need a 15 item measure to do this well. But it turns out that the single item measure really holds up. I've done a lot of validity tests and even when I put it in a lot of models where I like control for a really well measured like racial resentment, for example, it hangs in there. But nevertheless, I do have a longer measure that I've validated where I ask people things like how proud are you of your racial group? And I ask them things like, how much do you feel like you and other white people have in common? How strongly do you identify with other white people? And then I also have this separate measure of consciousness, which I talked about, which includes all of these measures of identity, coupled with things like, do you believe that employers are, that a lot of white people aren't getting jobs in the United States because employers are hiring racial and ethnic minorities instead? And then also, how important do you think it is the way people should work together to change laws that they see as unfair to other white people? So these are the different measures that I have.
Cool. Next question is from Matthijs Roduin. Thanks, Ashley. Very interesting presentation. I was wondering could you tell us more about those who score high on your white identity measure, but are not negative about immigration, positive about Trump? What kind of group is this group that strongly focuses on their own racial group, but does not combine it with racial prejudice towards outgroups?
Yeah, so this is a really great way to clarify my point. There are a lot of people who are high on white identity who aren't high on racial prejudice, but nevertheless support Donald Trump and are opposed to immigration. So let me talk about those people, and then I'm going to talk about sort of this other set of people that you're actually not asking about, but that are in fact relevant to your question. So the reason that this is true, right? Having the sense of racial animosity or racial prejudice, like for a long time, and I'd say even still today, there are lots of norm violations. That's seen as a norm violation. Like it's seen as bad, actually, despite the political climate in the United States. It's usually seen as bad to have the set of prejudice toward people of color. But I think a lot of white Americans who don't dislike racial and ethnic minorities nevertheless sit there and they say, hey, I'm worried about my group. I'm worried about what the United States is going to look like when white people are no longer a majority. And a lot of these same people say there and say like, I don't dislike people of color, but nevertheless I realize that I get a lot of benefits and there's a lot of privilege that I'm imbued with by way of my racial group. And so a lot of those people say, for example, I don't want higher levels of immigration, not because I don't like Latinos. I don't want higher levels of immigration because I don't like what it's doing to the culture in the United States. I don't like that it's changing the image of the United States as one that I know or one that I appreciate. And so I think that's part of the danger of this, is that you have two sets of people who are arriving at, in many ways, some of the same exact policy preferences, but for different reasons, for different psychological reasons. And the other thing too is that this makes white identity in some ways like a far more threatening and potent force in American politics, because it doesn't have all of this sort of these concerns about norm violations around it. A lot of white people think, I can't say bad things about people of color. I shouldn't think bad things about people of color. But we don't have their same beliefs about white identity. A lot of white people instead say like, well, Black and brown people get to organize around their race. Like, surely as a white person, I should be able to do that too. Now, of course, believing that also means that you have to basically deny all like racial and ethnic inequality in the United States. But a lot of people do. They don't see prejudice or discrimination as a problem. And so they therefore think like, I should have I should have a white organization if Black people get to have a Black organization. And so I think that makes it a little bit more worrisome and troubling. But just to really quickly speak to a sort of different set of white identifiers, there are people who, it's a small percentage of the population, but there are these sort of like very progressive, often very educated white people who say, I recognize that my identity as a white person is important because I know that white people are privileged and that the system disadvantages people of color. And they sort of take this very like socially progressive, kind of like woke sort of approach to answering this question. The problem is that like there aren't a lot of people who actually feel that way, and that you actually find them across the whole range of the white identity scale. So some people say, who have these beliefs, say my identity is important to me, and others of them say, I know what you're up to with this question. My white identity is not at all important to me. So the measure's a little bit noisy, but when you control for things like education, it tends to kind of tighten up the effects of the scale.
Alrighty, we have a question from anonymous attendee. Thank you for the interesting presentation. What additional identities do you think increase the salience of white identity and decrease its importance? For example, are cisgender white men more likely to identify with a white identity than those who are non-binary or gender non-conforming folks?
Well, I don't know about non-binary or gender non-conforming folks. That's a really interesting question. Unfortunately, there often aren't enough of those people on public opinion surveys to really draw many conclusions about them. But what you might find surprising is that it's actually not, so if you look at the relationship between gender and a propensity to identify as white, it's actually white women who are more likely to adopt a white identity. And you might think, well, why is that? But my hunch, and I think this is, there's a lot of evidence that I'm on the right track here in thinking about this, is that, in the United States, if you are given a preference between a racial identity and a gender identity and you're a woman, like, social identity theory would tell us you're going to adopt the higher status identity. So for white women, like there's, I think, a preference for picking your racial identity because the gender identity is the lower status identity. And there are lots of things to indicate that this is true, right? So like white women, not only more likely to vote for Trump, but in 2020 than 2016, but you see this big education gap between white women. So white women without a college degree, more likely to identify as white, also more likely to support Trump. The other thing that I've seen is there's a decline in levels of white identity in the US following the 2016 election, I think in part because of the association between Trump and white identity. A lot of people started to see it as slightly problematic, as slightly distasteful. You did start to see kind of these norms building around what it means to identify as white. So there's this decline, and I looked to see, like what things predict decline. And actually it turns out that the one group that really held in there that didn't decrease in levels of white identity was white women. And I think part of this is like in the 2016 election, for white women, the white woman candidate lost, right? And so there's this, I think, again, thinking about status here, white women are more likely to hang on to this identity. So the stereotype, of course, is that it's the white working class man who identifies as white, but actually not true. If anything, it's the white woman without a college degree who is kind of, and I should say too, these effects are like, the distinction here is not enormous. They're, like, white identity is well distributed across the whole range of demographics in the United States. But if there is some relationship that's significant, it's definitely gender.
That's super interesting. I'm returning to some of Ursula Dexeker's questions. Her second question was, how do you think partisan identities interact with racial identities? And could this be is it a plausible explanation for why some studies find stronger motivated reasoning among Republicans?
Yeah, so one thing that continues to be, I think, surprising to me is the extent to which a lot of white Democrats have this white identity that works in the same way it does for white Republicans. And I think that part of the reason is that the parties haven't really sent or hadn't sent, in 2012 and even into 2016, like you hadn't had this like long period of parties sending signals about which party is the party of white identity. You had plenty of time for the parties to send signals about which parties like don't, which parties support people of color and which parties don't. But I think that what we're going to see is that more white identifiers are going to move into the Republican camp, but that kind of sorting hasn't completely happened yet. So there's some indication by, like, I think Efraim Perez has a paper that he's been working on where he finds that actually the effect of white identity is stronger among Democrats than Republicans with respect to some policies. I don't find that effect consistently in my work. But the sort of very straightforward answer to your question is that right now, the effect of white identity on political attitudes is pretty similar among both Republicans and Democrats. But it's clear that Republican elites and the Republican Party is making a much stronger effort to try to appeal to the people in the American population who have this racial identity. And that probably is going to have some interesting downstream effects.
Thanks. Also, another question from Robin Totschel. Do you think that identity politics is always aimed at establishing, reinforcing group differences? My impression is that, for instance, Black identity politics try to aim for the opposite, the deconstruction of group differences, or at least their hierarchical dimension.
I don't think that the history of identity politics in the United States for Black people is about the deconstruction of group differences, but certainly the deconstruction of a hierarchy, absolutely. If you go back even and look at some of the rhetoric during the 1960s in the US around the civil rights movement, you had people like Martin Luther King and certainly Malcolm X, right? Malcolm X's whole approach was to sort of not just cultivate the sense of identity, but create this whole sense of Black nationalism. But Martin Luther King also very clearly spelled out the need for this development of a group identity and a group consciousness. And I think this is motivated by a couple things for subordinated groups. It's one, both a way to sort of transform a subjugated group identity to one that's an empowering group identity, right? To like the cultivation of this identity is you are socialized in a society that tells you that it's bad to be Black. So let's kind of like appropriate that and say, no, you should be proud to be Black instead. And that then has this other important effect, which is that the development of these group identities is meant to be politically mobilizing so that people can work to fight to achieve greater levels of equality. And so, when people complain about identity politics in the United States, as they often do, my thought about this is always that identity politics outside the bounds of white identity politics has always been in the service of trying to achieve greater political empowerment and greater racial equality, or not just racial equality, but equality for marginalized and subordinated groups. And so it's a combination of the things that you mentioned, both trying to exacerbate group differences for this empowering effect, but the empowering effect is meant to deconstruct hierarchies.
Yes, thanks. I take the freedom to also ask you a question. For full disclosure, I was in the APSA committee that awarded you the Best Book Award in political psychology. So I did read the book. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, and it's fully deserved, and I also still want to personally congratulate you by this way. But you have in the end of the book, you have a little section on what white identity politics might mean in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. And you speculate a little bit about Western Europe as well. And so could you help me clarify a little bit but what your thoughts are where white identity would fit in? Because is it sort of the predecessor of nationalism, or are it components that can consist next to each other? Or so do you have some thoughts, and are you testing this as well? And just curious to hear some of your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I'm also curious to hear all of your thoughts on this, because in many ways you'll have so much more insight than I do into this. But so my understanding is that to the extent that like identity politics matters in Western Europe, and I think that it works very similarly in Canada, and let me take a step back and say that, so one of the big differences between Europe and Canada and the United States is that in the US, we constantly talk about race and we constantly talk about our objective group identity. So anytime you have to, like, you go to the doctor's office, you apply for anything, like whether that's to go to college or a loan or whatever, you check a box to say what race you are, right? And there, you know, like in Canada, right? Like I gave this talk in Canada. It took me a long time to understand a question that somebody in the audience asked. They were like, well, how do you know like these people are white? Like, how do they know that they're white? And I was like, wait, what do you mean? I don't understand. Like, and so it occurred to me that like in the US, we all walk around every day aware of what our objective racial group is. It doesn't mean that it's always important to us or that it like affects how we see the world or we see, you know, in a way that's obvious to us or that it affects our politics, but we all are very practiced at knowing which box to check. And so I think that, you know, in Canada and Western Europe, the sort of push away from that, and in some ways, the fact that in some places it's not permitted to even ask that question, coupled with the fact that like these are you know Canada to some extent, but like Western Europe, you don't see yourselves as like a nation of immigrants, right? So the prominent identity is this national identity, but behind that, right? Like, what does it mean to be like British, right? What does it mean to be French? Well, what it means to be is very much the image of a white person, right? And so I think that the US has had to reconcile with race and citizenship and national identity for basically the entirety of its history. And so for us, national identity has always been a story and a wrestling with like what race gets to be defined as American. But for parts of, you know, Western Europe, this influx of immigration that has sort of led to questions about national identity that are tied up in race is much more recent. And so it's like, I think that means that sort of this question between what is a racial identity and what is a national identity it hasn't been kind of rehashed and rehearsed for, you know, like centuries at this point. And so I think right now, the language of identity is very much one that's tied up in nationalism. But I would argue that, like, when you start to peel back the layers, even though you're not talking about identity in terms of racial terms, that it's still nevertheless one that is very racialized. But the question for me is then what happens if you actually ask these white identity questions in Western Europe? And I don't know the answer. Like, I suspect that probably more people than we might realize are going to say that their racial identity is important to them. But I bet a lot of those people who might say that are also going to say like, no, it's not white that's being important to me. It's British that's being important to me. But then if you try to poke at this a little bit more, I would say that like, well, you think that being British also means being white, right? But I'd love to know what you all think about this too.
What do you think, Gijs? I think, well, let me throw Gijs in front of the bus, but I don't know.
But then I do have an answer. Well, maybe.
Go ahead.
But
yeah.
I mean, there are also very different ways to conceptualize national identities, and there's certainly more racial ways to do this, and so you have something called like racial nationalism versus civic nationalism, right? So the civic nationalism would be much more sort of a norm-based type of nationalism, which, for example, may have been much more prominent in parts of Europe when they had sort of these super large empires where they were actually trying to integrate mostly other whites, not so much or elites from, say, India or something. But yeah, that would be my. So yeah, there's sort of different options here, routes to take in order to mobilize potential in and out groups, and that would be my take. But
that's interesting, Mike. One of the things I'm wondering is, so, in the US, the idea of civic nationalism is also really tied up in race, in part because our civic nationalism is so associated with these beliefs about individualism and the Protestant work ethic. And one of the ways that the sort of in the history of the United States, we have marginalized Black people in particular is by constantly casting them as people who do not subscribe to those particular beliefs. And so I wonder if that's also true in Europe, or if that is becoming true, this sort of like that you can actually divorce conversations of civic nationalism from the stereotypes that are being attributed to, immigrants and to non-white people coming into these countries.
And maybe to add, I also, maybe to add to what Gijs said, I think that there are politicians in especially on the right hand side of the spectrum that did pay attention to what happened in the US, and they are trying to I think also facilitate and strengthen this sort of white identity that you describe. And this doesn't appeal to a lot of the mass, but I think there's some. It would be interesting if this is activating a certain group of people who are white identifiers, or makes it more salient, because I think that's what is happening, this sort of immigrants taking over the country. And that there's some of these similar discussions in the Netherlands or in other countries, like whether or not white people will remain a majority, which is obviously objectively a different context, but there is this sort of activation from the top down that is happening.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. So really related to that, so I started this work a long time ago. Like, I started doing this work in graduate school long before Donald Trump was, that anyone thought he was going to be a political candidate. So like, I was looking at this stuff like, gosh, in like 2007. And one of the things that I kept coming across in my work was the fact that so many of the conversations that I expected people in the US to be having about like immigration and demographic change and whiteness, when I would like Google stuff to try to find like conversations in the media and, like in various places on the web, I would actually constantly come across people in Western Europe and groups in Western Europe concerned about US demographic change. So it's like a lot of the earliest explicit conversations about this were happening among like right-wing groups in Europe who were focused on the United States and the implications of what that meant for sort of whiteness generally. And so this is another reason also that to think that like this, it's not just that the psychological phenomena that we're talking about are universalistic in some ways, but just how connected these themes are across different countries, and how I think that it's really important for other people too. Like I'm not the best person to do to this, but like other people who sort of know this stuff to start thinking about what this means in Europe and to do it in this comparative context.
Yeah. I think we should round up, right, Bert? Yeah. I'm sorry, particularly Robin. He had another question, but we're getting out of time. I want to thank Ashley for a great talk, super informative. I think we all learned a lot. And I want to thank you by giving you the Hot Politics Lab coffee mug. I actually don't have one here. Sorry, but yeah, it's in my office. So hopefully, once we're all we've all been vaccinated by Pfizer, we can go to a conference, and I will bring a whole suitcase of coffee mugs to about 30 different people now who've given talks since March. So
that's awesome. Thank you. Yeah. That's so nice. I really appreciate you all having me. I'm very excited about this coffee mug because I've started a collection of them in my office.
Oh, okay.
And so I'm like so happy that I can. It's very nice. But
you don't actually drink coffee, do you? Or
oh no, I do. I've got my coffee right here, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, so. But I think I'm excited to have this Hot Politics one. That's awesome. But you all have been so fun to talk with, and this has been really thoughtful and informative, and you've given me some great ideas too for thinking about some comparative work. So I really appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks. Let me end with briefly announcing our upcoming talks. Next week, we have Ursula Hess, professor at Humboldt University Berlin, to give a talk about facial mimicry in social context. And I must say, Ursula Hess, I'm really excited to have her because she's really the world expert in psychology in terms of facial mimicry. So I think that's going to be really exciting. Then that's on November 20. Then on November 27, we have Graduate Friday again. with Tobias Rohrbach and Lala Muradova. And then we're going into December, 4th of December, Marieke van der Velde will give a talk. And the week after that, Patrick Stewart will give a talk about facing Farage, using the combinational processing model of emotion to understand UK and US citizen appraisal of immigration arguments. So lots of interesting talks to look out for. Also, please forward the programs to your colleagues and friends. Also, you can always listen to our talks afterwards via Spotify or YouTube. We've seen quite a recent increase in popularity of our Spotify channel. So please spread the gospel, and thank you for being here today, and I hope to see you soon.